The city had fallen into night, shrouded in a shroud of silence, interrupted only by the occasional car headlight flickering on the deserted streets. Somewhere in the distance, the wind rustled through the abandoned alleys. Here in the suburbs, danger always seemed far away until you became its target. Jamal, a tall and skinny teenager, was walking home after a long evening at school. He was one of those kids who wasn't afraid to dream big, a future in which he would become an architect and be able to move far away from here. But dreams seem so fragile when the sound of brakes behind you and the flash of flashing lights color the asphalt a disturbing blue and red. "Hey, you! Stop!" The voice was harsh, devoid of any sympathy. Jamal froze, feeling the cold creeping under his jacket. His heart raced as he looked around and saw the massive figure of a police officer stepping out of his patrol car. A flashlight gleamed in his hands, pointed directly at the teenager's face like a spotlight on a criminal. "What are you doing here at this hour?" The policeman stepped closer, looking Jamal over from head to toe. The officer had a grimace of suspicion on his face, heightened by the shadow of his own prejudices. "I'm just going home, sir," Jamal replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though everything inside was trembling. "Home? In this neighborhood?" The policeman grinned as if he'd heard a bad joke. "Do you have identification?" "Yes, of course, sir." Jamal slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "Hands. Where do I see them?" The officer shouted, and his hand swiftly reached for the stun gun. 1 second. Time seemed to slow down. Jamal froze in place, his gaze fixed on the policeman's outstretched arm. The thin beam of the flashlight now seemed to burn through the teenager's skin, and the tension built like the storm before the storm. "Sir, he began, but the officer interrupted. "Don't move, kid. You're only here because you're doing something illegal, and we're gonna find out." The words echoed in Jamal's chest like a blow. He knew that nothing he said would change the situation. To the officer, his skin color was already an accusation. The tension in the air was thickening with each passing moment. Jamal heard only his own rapid breathing and the thudding of his heart. There was no one in the street, just him and the man in uniform, gun in hand. Something was wrong, and this night was going to be a nightmare. "Are you deaf?" I said, "hands up." The officer's voice hit my ears like a whiplash. Jamal raised his hands, feeling his throat constrict with fear. It seemed to him that he was standing in the center of the stage, illuminated by a bright light, where every step he took, every glance, could be the cause of a new outbreak of aggression. "Where's your ID?" The officer stepped forward, his heavy boots squeaking loudly on the pavement. "You probably think you can just walk around here like nothing's wrong, don't you? You're not in your ghetto, kid." "I have the papers, sir," Jamal tried to answer, feeling his voice shaking. He slowly reached into his back pocket. "I said, don't move." The policeman shouted at him again, grabbing his holster. "You want me to think you're going for a gun? Your brother or friend has been arrested for this before, hasn't he?" "No, sir. I just got home from school." Jamal started, but the words stuck in his throat as the officer stepped closer, looming over him like a storm cloud. "School, you say? That's funny. You look like you're hiding something. Drugs, maybe? Or stolen goods?" The cop grinned, glancing at Jamal. "I know your type. You're just waiting for the moment to do something." As if his words were a signal, the officer took a sharp step forward, grabbed Jamal by his jacket, and pulled him toward him. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he growled. "You're not so tough, are you? Where are your friends now? They won't get you out of this hole." Jamal's eyes filled with tears, but he held back as best he could, not allowing himself to show weakness. He stared into the officer's cold eyes, trying to read a shadow of humanity, but he found only contempt. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," he whispered, but it only made the policeman angry. "Nothing bad? You think I'm just here for nothing? You look like a criminal, kid. That's what you are. A criminal." The officer shoved him back, causing Jamal to stagger. "I'm sure you have a list of offenses you're carefully hiding. You were just waiting to get caught." As if to confirm his words, the policeman abruptly grabbed Jamal's shoulder and turned him back to his side. "Spread your legs wide. Put your hands on the car, quick," he ordered, and then added, barely audibly, but with obvious gloating, "Maybe this will teach you something." Jamal obediently stood up, feeling the humiliation sink into his skin, the cold of the metal of the police car leaving marks on his palms. He could hear the officer rummaging through his pockets, tossing everything he found to the ground: textbooks, keys, wallet. The wind picked up the pages of his school notebook, scattering them across the asphalt. "What's this?" The policeman picked up one of the notebooks. "Oh, you're a scientist too, huh? It's amazing that people like you even know how to hold a pen." The laughter, cold and filled with contempt, cut into Jamal's ears. He clenched his fists but dared not move. He knew that any movement could become an excuse for the officer, an excuse for the violence that was already in the air. "Well, smart guy, looks like you're in the clear," the officer finally said, tossing the notebook to the ground as if it were trash. "But remember, I'll be watching you. You can hide all you want, but I know who you really are." Jamal didn't answer. He just stood staring at the ground, feeling the anger, humiliation, and fear come in waves. The night went on, but for Jamal, it turned into endless darkness. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from and whether you've encountered something similar in your life. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and important topics we cover. And now we continue. Jamal was still standing by the patrol car, trying not to make any sudden movements. His palms rested against the cold metal, his eyes fixed on the ground where his books and notebooks lay torn and dirty. Fear, mixed with anger, was growing in his chest, but he knew he couldn't show emotion right now. It could cost him too much. "Do you think I'm joking?" the policeman growled, stepping closer. His heavy boots thudded loudly on the pavement, as if each note reminded Jamal that he had no way out. "When I talk to you, you have to answer. Or maybe you think I'm wasting my time." "Sir, I was just walking home," Jamal breathed out, his voice shaking, but he tried to sound confident. "Home?" The officer gave him a look that was more like a sentence. "Tell me, what decent person walks the streets at a time like this? Especially—" He paused, as if enjoying his power. "Especially someone like you?" Jamal tried to turn his head to explain that he was just returning from school, but the movement was taken as a challenge. "Don't move," the policeman shouted, pulling a stun gun from his holster. "Are you stupid? You're just trying to get me, aren't you? You think I can't see you're up to something?" Jamal froze. He raised his hands a little higher, showing that he was unarmed, but the fear in his eyes only irritated the officer. "Of course you're one of them. I'm sure you've lied to the police hundreds of times," the officer hissed, stepping forward. His hand gripped the stun gun tighter. "But I won't catch you at it. Too sneaky, huh?" "I didn't do anything, sir, please." Jamal tried to explain, but his voice was too weak against the thunder of police anger. "Enough!" The officer shouted, and then, without waiting for any resistance, fired the stun gun. 2 electrodes stuck into the teenager's clothes, and the electric shock instantly shackled his body. The pain was like fire, burning every cell. Jamal felt his legs buckle, and his body hit the pavement uncontrollably. His hands twitched reflexively, trying to get rid of the invisible grip, but the current wouldn't let go. The officer stood over him, his face frozen in a strange grin. There was no sympathy or regret in his eyes, only the cold pleasure of being in complete control of the situation. "That's better," he said, removing the stun gun. "Now you'll understand what it means to obey. You think I'm joking? It's for your own good, kid. Guys like you need to be put in their place right away." Jamal lay on the ground, his body still twitching from the remnants of the discharge. He could hardly breathe, and his gaze was fixed on the night sky. Every breath hurt, but it hurt even more the realization of helplessness. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body wouldn't listen and fear paralyzed his mind. "Get up!" the officer ordered, but Jamal couldn't get up. His hands were shaking, his legs refused to hold him up. "Are you kidding me? Or should I stimulate you again?" The policeman grabbed his arm, yanking him up roughly, forcing Jamal to his knees. Pain pierced his shoulder, but he dared not even cry out. Only one thought swirled around in his head. Why is this happening? Why to me? "Look at me," the officer demanded, leaning closer. "You'll thank me for this lesson, boy. Guys like you never learn otherwise." Jamal looked up. His eyes met the cold, icy eyes of the policeman, and in that moment he realized this was not just a man standing in front of him. This was a system, indifferent and cruel, that saw him as a threat only because of the color of his skin. In the deserted street, the silence was broken by the heavy breathing sounds of Jamal, who was still trying to regain consciousness, and the sharp shouts of the policeman. The surrounding darkness seemed to greedily absorb what was happening, but at that moment windows in the neighboring houses began to light up. People, attracted by the noise, looked out into the street, watching the scene that was unfolding before their eyes. On the other side of the street, a couple stood hesitating. The woman tugged quietly at the man's sleeve. "Isn't there something we can do?" "This looks awful," she whispered. "Don't get involved," he replied dryly. "This is the police and we don't know anything. What if he really did something?" In the distance, teenagers who were sitting on a bench pulled out their phones and began filming. The cameras captured footage of Jamal kneeling, trembling and humiliated, begging for justice, but none of them came any closer. "It's none of our business," one of them said, glancing around nervously. "They can take us too." "But that's wrong, man. You see, he didn't do anything," the other replied, but still remained where he was, clutching the phone in his hands. The policeman, noticing that his actions had attracted attention, grinned. He was clearly enjoying the situation. "Can everyone see?" he threw loudly, glancing around at the passers-by hiding in the shadows. "That's how the law works. If anyone decides to play by the rules, it's the same way." His voice sounded confident, almost boastful. For him, this moment was not just a test of strength, but a demonstration of power that no one dared challenge. Jamal looked up. His eyes met those of a woman standing at the window of a nearby house. She turned away quickly, pulling down the curtains as if she was afraid this silent cry for help might get her into trouble. Every movement, every look in that moment reminded Jamal that he was completely alone. Even in the crowd, even with dozens of eyes watching him, no one was going to interfere. "Get up!" the policeman ordered, tugging him roughly by the shoulder. Jamal tried to get up, but his legs shook. The policeman grinned again and pushed him back to the ground. "You're useless, kid. That's why people like you need to be kept away from normal people." These words echoed down the empty street, making even those who were silently watching feel uncomfortable. One of the teenagers filming the scene muttered nervously, "He's totally overreacting." "Do you want to interfere?" his friend asked coldly. "No? Then keep quiet and take it off." Jamal tried to turn toward the officer. His voice was weak, but he pulled himself together to speak. "Why are you doing this to me?" "I didn't do anything wrong." The policeman leaned over him, his face frozen in a grin that looked more like a predatory stare. "Because you look like you could. That's why." He straightened up and looked around the crowd again as if addressing them. "And if any of you think I'm wrong, come over here and tell me so." No one moved from their seat. No one said a word. Only the quiet rustle of clothes, the receding footsteps, and the barely audible clanking of cameras. The witnesses preferred to remain observers, shielding themselves with an invisible wall from the horror that was happening right in front of their eyes. Jamal was alone again. Alone on the cold street, with broken dreams and a hope that melted like ice under the merciless sun. The cold of the asphalt penetrated every cell of Jamal's body. He felt the remnants of the electric shock run through his limbs, leaving behind pain and weakness. His head throbbed with humiliation, resentment, and fear. The air seemed thick, as if every molecule was saturated with the injustice of this night. But something inside him was screaming, "Be silent, submit, just wait for this to be over." Yet another voice, the one he'd heard from his mother, from his teachers, from his own dreams, thundered, "You must not endure this. You have to fight it." His breath hitched, but he raised his head. His heart pounded frantically as he realized that if he kept silent now, no one would ever know what had happened here. He had to do something, even if it was hopeless. "Help!" His voice, shaky but filled with desperation, cut through the night silence echoing down the street. The policeman, standing over him, instantly tensed. His face showed anger, as if the shout had been an insult to him personally. "Shut up!" he roared, leaning closer. His hand reached for the stun gun again, and his gaze was cold and cruel. "You think you can make a scene here? You think anyone cares about you? Look around you. All they're doing is watching. No one's coming to help you." Jamal glanced at the surrounding houses, at the windows that hid faces behind them. He could see the curtains drawing quickly as soon as he tried to meet someone's eyes. But he kept hoping that maybe someone would dial the emergency number now. Someone would decide to intervene. "Please, help me!" he screamed again, his voice breaking in pain. "This isn't right. A sharp jolt interrupted his scream. The policeman grabbed him by the shoulder and flipped him roughly onto his back, pressing his chest so hard that Jamal felt his lungs constrict. "I said shut up. You think you can talk when I didn't give you permission?" The policeman leaned in so close that his breath burned Jamal's face. "You are just a nobody. You're nothing. And now I'm going to show you what happens to people like you when they decide they can play by their own rules." "You can't do this," Jamal wheezed, trying to get the words out of his throat, but the pressure increased and he coughed as he tried to breathe. "I can, and I will," the policeman said icily. He straightened and turned again to the crowd hiding in the shadows. "See? That's how you treat them. No pity, no patience. They understand only force." Jamal tried to scream again, But then the policeman pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them right in front of the teenager's face. "You want more trouble, boy? 'Cause I could put you in jail right now. And you know what the funny thing is? Nobody's even going to ask questions. Nobody's going to come to your rescue, because you're the one that everybody's afraid of. That's how the world works." These words felt like they were tearing Jamal's soul apart. He felt like a prisoner not only of this situation, but of a system that allowed men like this policeman to do evil with impunity. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body was too weak, and fear for his life shackled his will. "Yeah, I just want to go home," he whispered, looking into the officer's eyes, hoping for a drop of humanity. But there was only ice. The policeman grinned, grabbed Jamal by the collar of his jacket, and yanked him up sharply, forcing him to his knees. "Home?" he snorted. "Your place is not home. Your home will be a cell. Or do you think people like you can just walk my streets? That's why I wear this uniform, to keep order. You're a mess, and I'm going to clean it up." As if to confirm his words, he pushed Jamal backward, and he collapsed to the ground again. Footsteps sounded in the distance. Some of the spectators decided to leave, unable to bear the spectacle, but most of them remained standing, silently watching. Jamal closed his eyes, feeling his strength leave him. He realized he wasn't going to win this fight, but a realization burned inside him. He mustn't be silent, because if he remained silent now, it would happen again, to someone else, and no one would hear them scream. The dark, silent morning found Caroline in her study. The silence of the house had always seemed peaceful to her, but this night it was different. Heavy, suffocating. A tall stack of cases lay before her, but Caroline couldn't focus. In her job as a prosecutor, injustice and evil were not foreign concepts, but at this moment it seemed to her that something terrible was in the air. The ringing sounded suddenly, breaking the silence. The phone screen glowed with her son's name, and for a moment she was relieved. But when she picked up the phone, she immediately realized something was wrong. Jamal was usually energetic, his voice always sounding confident, but now all she heard was a shiver and a silence between words that screamed louder than any sound. "Mom," he began, his voice weak as a whisper. "I really need to talk to you." "Jamal, what happened? Are you all right?" Caroline asked, feeling anxiety constrict her chest. "Yeah, I don't know." He fell silent, and on the other end of the line she heard his breathing, deep, like he was trying to cope with something terrible. "It's a cop. He attacked me." The words made Caroline freeze. She felt something hot, angry inside her, but she restrained herself, trying to speak softly. "Jamal, are you safe? What happened?" She started pacing the room, her heels thudding on the wooden floor. Jamal told everything from beginning to end, about how he'd been pulled over, how the officer had humiliated him, used a stun gun, and how no one had come to his aid. With each word, his voice grew shakier and shakier, and Caroline's hands clenched into fists. Her son, her child, was helpless before something she knew all too well, a system that too often left people like Jamal to fend for themselves. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked, trying to keep control. "Everything hurts, Mom, but I don't understand why. Why did he do it? I didn't do anything." His words sounded broken, like a man whose faith in justice had been shattered. Caroline felt hot tears come to her eyes, but she quickly pulled herself together. She needed to be strong, for him, for herself. "Listen to me, Jamal," she said firmly, her prosecutor's voice now confident and unobjectionable. "This will not go unpunished. I promise you, this man will answer for what he has done." "But, Mom, they'll all have his back, won't they?" "I've seen it happen," Jamal breathed out, uncertainty in his voice. "Known by the—" "Not this time. Not with me," Caroline said, and there was a power in her words that could shatter mountains. After hanging up the phone, she immediately sprang into action. She dialed the number of her assistant, waking him up in the middle of the night, and ordered him to immediately access the CCTV cameras in the area. She then called the station, demanding an explanation, but met only cold indifference and excuses. "Your son was acting suspiciously, ma'am," the officer on duty told her, his tone as icy as her rage. "Our officers followed protocol." "Protocol?" Caroline was almost shouting into the phone. "Your protocol is to beat up teenagers on the street, using force against an unarmed man? Is that what you call serving the community?" There was silence on the other end. She realized that these people weren't going to cooperate. But she wasn't one to give up. She knew that this night was just the beginning, that there was a battle ahead of her, and Caroline was ready to lead her. When she heard Jamal's voice again in the morning, her plan was almost complete. She told him that she would fight for him, that she would make sure no one else felt what he felt. There was steel in her voice, but deep down she knew. This battle would be long and dirty, because this wasn't just a fight for her son. It was a fight against the entire system. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from and whether you've encountered something similar in your life. Subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now we continue. Caroline lay awake all night. Every minute of inaction felt like a betrayal to Jamal. Her son had just faced a blatant injustice, and she knew she had an obligation to act quickly. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by case folders, she began to formulate a plan. But this wasn't just a case, this was her personal battle. The first thing she did was to check all possible CCTV cameras in the area where the incident had occurred. With the help of her connections in the police and city administration, she was able to access the footage that had been secured. Watching the footage, her heart clenched with pain as she saw her son, unarmed and defenseless, being thrown to the pavement, a policeman roughly pressing down on his shoulder, the crowd silent. How could they just watch? She whispered to herself, staring at the screen. Her next task was to find witnesses. Caroline personally went door to door in the neighborhood, knocking on doors, leaving no one untouched. In some places she was met with distrust, in others with apprehension. People didn't want to get into trouble. "I saw it, but what could I do?" said the elderly woman as she opened the door. "You realize that if I interfere, they will come to me too." "It was awful," admitted another, a young woman who looked out from behind the threshold. "But I'm sorry. I can't testify. I'm afraid for my family." Each rejection cut to the heart, but Caroline didn't give up. She knew the truth was on her side, and that gave her strength. She wrote down even the slightest hint of something that might help the case. Jamal, though traumatized both physically and mentally, insisted on accompanying her. He wanted to be a part of it, to show that he wouldn't give up. But his presence only emphasized the brutality of what had happened. His shoulder still ached from the rough treatment, and his eyes read the fear he tried to hide. "We'll get through this, son," Caroline said, putting her hand on his shoulder. "I'm not going to let this go unpunished." The next step was a medical examination. The doctor examined Jamal and recorded the taser marks, the bruises on his arms and shoulders, the scratches on his back. Caroline demanded that everything be recorded in detail so as not to leave the police any chance of excuses. These notes could be decisive, the doctor told her, holding out the report. But be careful. You know these cases can be difficult. She only nodded. Yes, she knew. The system was not her ally. Her enemy was not only this cop, but all those behind him, the department that covered their own, the community that kept quiet. But she was ready to challenge them all. Caroline used her connections in the legal system to find lawyers and activists who could support her case. She contacted journalists, provided them with video footage, and told Jamal's story. Soon, the first articles began appearing in local newspapers and later on national news. "This is not just my son," she said in an interview. "This is a child who has been victimized by a system built on prejudice. It can happen to anyone." But as attention to the case grew, so did the pressure. The police department began to defend itself, saying the officer's actions were justified, that Jamal was acting suspiciously. They tried to make him look like a bully who allegedly provoked the conflict. "They always do," said one of the lawyers Caroline worked with. "It's their standard tactic, to discredit the victim. But we have proof, and we'll beat them." All of this only made Caroline hotter. Her anger became her fuel. She realized that what was at stake was not only justice for her son, but hope for all those who suffered in the shadows of silence. She knew there was a long road ahead, but Caroline was ready for battle. This was her war, and she wasn't going to lose it. Caroline knew her path would be thorny, but even she didn't expect how aggressively the system would begin to defend itself. As soon as Jamal's story hit the news, the police department issued a statement the next day. Loud words full of cliches. Officers acted within protocol. Suspicious behavior, protection of public order. But the most humiliating part was the way they tried to smear her son. Jamal Simmons, the press release said, was in a neighborhood known for high crime rates. His actions were suspicious and he refused to cooperate with police. Those words hit Caroline like a slap in the face. She knew her son. He wasn't what they were trying to make him out to be. But now they were doing everything they could to make it look different. Comments started popping up on the internet. He must have done something. Why was he there so late? Logically, you shouldn't have provoked the police. Caroline read it, feeling rage flaring inside her, but she realized that this was only the beginning. Her son hadn't just been hurt by the actions of one policeman. Now the whole system was against them. The first blows followed quickly. The police department refused to provide additional patrol car camera footage, saying it was irrelevant. The officer's co-workers gave false statements, claiming that Jamal allegedly tried to flee and resisted arrest. Their statements were carefully coordinated, and each of them repeated the same story as if reading from a pre-prepared script. "They do it all the time," said one of the lawyers Caroline hired. "They do it all the time. First, they discredit the victim, then they block access to evidence, and finally, they do everything they can to confuse public opinion." Caroline couldn't stay away. She organized a press conference at which she presented surveillance footage that showed her son doing nothing suspicious. But even that sparked a wave of skepticism. The news began to run stories where commentators questioned Jamal's innocence, adding fuel to the fire. "Do you think it's just that?" thundered one of the guest experts on live TV. "Why was he there? Why didn't he comply immediately? We don't know all the details, and maybe the police had their reasons." Every word was like a stab in the back. Jamal sat next to her, listening to it all, and Caroline could see his face darken with anger and pain, but she wouldn't let him give up. "It's their way of scaring us," she told him. "They want us to give up, but we won't." Caroline started digging deeper. She discovered that the policeman who had attacked Jamal had previous complaints for abuse of power, but none of them had gone to trial. She contacted the lawyers who had handled those cases and learned that most of them had been hushed up. People were afraid to go against the system. "They will break you," one of the lawyers warned her. "They have enough resources to drag this case out for years. You'll have to be prepared for that." But Caroline was ready. She started looking for new witnesses, spreading the footage through social media, organizing protests. People began to respond. Jamal's story became a symbol of the fight against injustice, and the more pressure she put on the system, the more fierce their response. The police department launched an attack. They accused Caroline of obstruction of justice and called her actions an attempt at political manipulation. But she was undeterred. Each of their blows only strengthened her resolve. "They're trying to break us, Jamal," she said one night as they sat in her office. "But we are stronger because we are on the side of truth." Her words sounded confident, but she knew the fight had only just begun. She could feel the clouds gathering over them, the system trying to erase their story from people's memories. But Caroline was ready. She knew there would be new blows ahead, new humiliations, but she was ready to endure anything. For her son, for the truth, so that no one else would have to go through what Jamal had gone through. In Caroline's world, the word "give up" did not exist. She kept moving forward, despite the blows from the system and society. Each new day brought her new challenges, but she knew that behind every mask of the system there was a real human weakness. And soon she managed to find that one crack that changed everything. It started with one anonymous letter delivered to her home. The letter was typed on a plain white sheet of paper. No signature, no return address. But its contents took Caroline's breath away. "This isn't the first time Officer Brian Collins has abused his power. Check his old cases. You'd be surprised what you'll find." Caroline reacted immediately. Her intuition told her that this wasn't just a random letter. She knew someone was behind it who wanted to help but was afraid to reveal their name. She began digging into Officer Collins' past, utilizing her legal resources and connections. The initial findings were disturbing. Over the past 5 years, the officer has received more than a dozen complaints from citizens, but none of them have been brought to trial. The accusations ranged from excessive use of force to outright racism. People complained of humiliation, violence, threats. How could all this have been jammed together? Caroline asked her assistant, spreading out the documents she had found in front of her. "The system protects its own," he said quietly, "especially people like Collins. He's the perfect tool, aggressive, loyal, and willing to do what others dare not." Caroline dug deeper into the cases mentioned in the complaints. She found a woman who claimed Collins had used force against her husband during a routine traffic stop. The man had broken his arm, but the case was dismissed and the police report said he had resisted. In another case, a teenager similar to Jamal was detained by Collins for disorderly conduct. The teenager spent the night in the detention center, and after that, his family filed a complaint, claiming beatings. However, the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Caroline began to notice a pattern. All the victims were from disadvantaged neighborhoods. Almost all were black or other minorities. Complaints were always written, but the system shut them down, as if they were sucked into a vortex. Against this backdrop, Caroline came across a particularly shocking case. A year ago, Officer Collins was involved in the arrest of a young man who died as a result of use of force. The report listed the death as a heart attack, but the medical examiner contacted by Caroline revealed the details. "The case haunts me to this day," he told her over the phone. "I wrote in the report that he had broken ribs and a lacerated liver, but my words were ignored. The case was quickly closed and I was told to stay out of politics." This information stunned Caroline. The young man's death was just one of many stories lost in the department's archives. But what shocked her most were the blatant signs of a deliberate cover-up of the truth. Collins wasn't just an officer who overreached. He was part of a system designed to protect people like him. Caroline decided to reach out to the families of those already affected by Collins's actions. She met with them personally, listening to their stories. Each of them was filled with pain and humiliation. People were afraid, they thought it was futile to fight. But when they saw that Caroline was not giving up, they began to open up. "If someone had protected us then," said one of the mothers who lost her son, "maybe your boy wouldn't have been hurt." Those words were another blow to Caroline. She realized that her battle had long ago ceased to be personal. It was now a fight for everyone who had ever suffered injustice. She gave the collected materials to journalists, lawyers, and public organizations. Soon, large-scale protests began, and Collins's name became known to everyone. The police department became the center of attention, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the pressure. But Collins didn't give up. In an interview, he said, "This is a witch hunt. I'm just doing my job. Criminals will always try to discredit honest officers." These words caused a storm of indignation. For Caroline, they were the latest confirmation that the system was desperately protecting its monsters. She knew it would be a long road, but she already had the most important thing: the truth that could no longer be hidden. The day of the trial had arrived. The atmosphere in the hall was tense, like a taut string ready to burst. Every seat was occupied, and those who could not get in crowded outside the courthouse, holding placards and shouting slogans. The case, Jamal v. Officer Collins, had come to symbolize the fight against police violence and racial injustice, garnering national attention. But for Caroline, it was more than just a case. It was her life, her son, her attempt to wrest justice from a system that for too long had remained deaf to the cries of those it was supposed to protect. Collins entered the hall first, accompanied by his attorneys. He looked confident, almost mocking. His uniform was perfectly ironed, the awards on his chest gleaming. This was a man who was used to having the system protect him. Glancing toward Caroline and Jamal, he smiled slightly, as if he was already celebrating a victory. Caroline sat next to her son, holding his hand. She could feel him trembling, but she tried her best to show her calmness. She knew in her heart that the outcome of this case was far from certain. Her attorneys were prepared for any defense maneuvers, but even they recognized that the chances of winning against the police department were minimal. When the hearing began, the prosecutor opposing Collins presented his evidence. Video footage, eyewitness testimony, medical reports, it was all meticulously laid out. The surveillance camera that captured the moment of the attack was a key piece of evidence. The courtroom screen showed Collins using a stun gun against Jamal, the teen falling to the ground, the officer standing over him with a cold sneer. A sepulchral silence hung in the hall. "Dear court," said the prosecutor, This footage shows a clear abuse of power and the use of excessive force. Jamal Simmons did not pose a threat, but he was humiliated, abused, and deprived of his right to respect and dignity. When Collins's defense began to take the stand, the situation changed dramatically. The officer's attorneys tried to shift the focus to Jamal's identity. They raised the question of why he was in a dangerous neighborhood at night, hinting that his actions could have been construed as suspicious. "My client acted in accordance with protocol," Collins's attorney stated. "He saw behavior that could be construed as threatening and took action to protect public order. Combine that with the high crime rate in the area where the victim was located, and the officer's actions seem not only reasonable, but necessary." Caroline clenched her fists. Her face remained calm, but inside her, rage boiled. They were trying to make her son look guilty, trying over and over to justify what was unjustifiable. She knew it was a standard method of defense: discredit the victim, shift the blame. Her attorneys, however, were prepared. They presented evidence of previous complaints against Collins, testimony from other victims, and medical reports indicating his propensity for violence. Each new fact made the officer's defense more and more vulnerable. Even so, Caroline could see that the judge was hesitant. There was doubt, perhaps fear, in his eyes. The climax came when Caroline was given the floor. She stood up, her voice firm and resolute. "My son is not just a name in this case. He is a teenager who has been victimized by a system designed to protect people like Collins. It's a system that covers for them, that justifies their actions, even when they are clearly outside the law. But I'm not just here today for my son. I'm here for anyone who has ever been afraid to stand up against injustice." Her words caused a storm of applause in the audience, but the judge quickly interrupted the noise by calling for order. When the judge left for sentencing, it was as if time stood still. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. After a few languid minutes, he returned. There was absolute silence in the hall. "Officer Collins," the judge began, "although the evidence against you is substantial, there is a lack of direct evidence of intent to injure the victim. The court finds—" Caroline held her breath. "To acquit the defendant." These words rang through the hall like thunder. Shouts of protest erupted instantly. Caroline felt Jamal squeeze close to her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them spill. Collins stood up, grinning, and headed for the exit. He knew he'd won. The system had his back again, as it always did. But something had changed. The protests outside the court grew even louder. People demanded justice. Jamal's story united them, made them rise up against the system. Caroline knew this verdict wasn't the end. It was just a new chapter in the struggle. She stood up, took her son's hand, and looked him in the eye. "We're not done, Jamal. This fight is still to come, and we will win. Not for us, but for everyone." Her words were quiet, but filled with power, a strength that neither the court's verdict nor a system built on injustice could destroy. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you had any incidents of racism in your life? Your opinions and stories are incredibly important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you and thank you for your support. Subscribe to our channel and like us to make sure you don't miss out on new stories. We wish you a good day and justice in every moment of life.